1. The phantom footsteps on Tower Ridge. An encounter with the unseen. The first time it happened, the fire lookout stationed on Tower Ridge dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination. It was a quiet night, the kind that lulls the mind into a peaceful state. But then, out of the silence, came the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, and unmistakable. They started at the base of the metal stairs leading up to the tower and began to climb step by step. The lookout's heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, reverberating through the steel structure. Gripping a flashlight, the lookout peered down the stairwell, expecting to see a hiker or perhaps another lookout. But there was no one there. The footsteps continued, climbing ever closer, until they reached the top platform where the lookout stood frozen in fear. The steps circled the platform as if someone or something was inspecting the tower. But no one appeared. The footsteps stopped directly behind the lookout, who turned around only to find empty air. This eerie experience repeated itself several times throughout the season, always in the dead of night, leaving the lookout to wonder if the tower was haunted by a restless spirit. 2. The mysterious smoke signal at midnight, the disappearing fire of Devil's Ridge. Devil's Ridge was known for its eerie beauty, rugged cliffs, dense forests, and an ever-present fog that seemed to cling to the landscape. It was also known for strange occurrences, but nothing could prepare the lookout stationed there for what happened one fateful night. Just past midnight, as the lookout was scanning the horizon, they noticed a thin column of smoke rising from the trees. It was a clear sign of a fire, so the lookout immediately radioed for backup, relaying the coordinates and describing the situation. But as they watched, something strange happened. The smoke began to waver and then fade, as if being swallowed by the night itself. Within minutes, the smoke had completely disappeared, leaving no trace behind. The next morning, a search team was dispatched to the area, but they found nothing, no fire, no charred earth, and no signs that a blaze had ever existed. The lookout was left to ponder whether they had witnessed a natural phenomenon or something far more sinister. Some locals whispered that the ridge was cursed and that the smoke was a warning from spirits long dead. Whatever the explanation, the experience left the lookout deeply unsettled, haunted by the memory of the smoke that wasn't really there. 3. The shadow in the forest. A stalker from beyond the trees. Blackwood Forest was a place of deep shadows and towering trees, where the silence of the wilderness was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. For the lookout stationed there, the forest was both a sanctuary and a source of constant unease. It started with a fleeting glimpse, a dark shape moving among the trees just at the edge of the lookout's vision. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. But as the days passed, the shadow became more persistent. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lookout would catch sight of the shadow lurking in the distance. It seemed to move with intent, always staying just out of clear view, as if it was aware of being watched. The lookout began to feel as if they were being hunted by some unseen force, something that was neither animal nor human. One night, the shadow drew closer than ever before, lingering at the edge of the clearing surrounding the tower. The lookout could feel its presence, a palpable sense of dread that made the hair on the back of their neck stand on end. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow melted back into the forest, leaving the lookout shaken and deeply disturbed. The following morning, they searched the area but found nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling of being watched never left, and the lookout couldn't shake the sense that something was still out there, waiting in the darkness. 4. The whispering wind of Pine Mountain. Voices from the wilderness. Pine Mountain was known for its fierce winds, which howled through the trees and rattled the fire lookout tower perched at its summit. But for the lookout station there, the wind carried more than just the sound of rustling leaves. It carried voices. It started as a faint murmur, barely audible over the sound of the wind. The lookout thought they were imagining things, but as the days turned into weeks, the voices became clearer. They seemed to whisper their name, beckoning them to step outside the safety of the tower and into the wilderness below. The voices were persistent, growing louder at night when the wind was at its strongest. It was as if the mountain itself was alive, trying to communicate with the lone lookout. One particularly stormy night, the voices grew so loud that the lookout could no longer ignore them. They ventured outside, braving the howling wind and freezing temperatures, hoping to find some rational explanation. But the moment they stepped out onto the platform, the voices stopped. The wind died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The lookout retreated back inside, but the feeling of unease lingered. From that night on, the voices returned only occasionally, but each time they did, the lookout felt a deep sense of dread. Were the voices a product of the wind, or was something else lurking on Pine Mountain, something ancient and malevolent? 5. The unseen watcher of Bear Valley, a silent stalker in the woods. Bear Valley was a place of breathtaking beauty, rolling hills, dense forests, and a meandering river that sparkled in the sunlight. But for the fire lookout stationed there, it was also a place of deep, unsettling fear. From the moment they arrived, the lookout felt as if they were being watched. At first, they dismissed it as paranoia. After all, the isolation and solitude could play tricks on the mind. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. It was as if there was someone, or something, just out of sight, watching their every move. The lookout began to notice subtle signs that they weren't alone, footprints in the dirt that didn't match their own, the feeling of eyes on them even when they were inside the tower, and a constant sense of unease that they couldn't shake. One night, while scanning the forest with binoculars, the lookout spotted something unusual, a figure standing just inside the tree line, staring directly at the tower. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but its presence sent a chill down the lookout's spine. They called out, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. The lookout turned away for just a moment to grab their radio, but when they looked back, the figure was gone. The experience left the lookout rattled, and though they never saw the figure again, the feeling of being watched never left. They completed their season at Bear Valley, but the memory of that silent, unseen watcher stayed with them long after they returned to civilization. 6. The eerie glow beyond the trees. A lookout's encounter with the unexplainable. It was a calm, clear night at Pine Hollow, and the fire lookout on duty was enjoying the peacefulness of the evening. The stars were bright, the air was crisp, and all seemed right with the world. But then, just beyond the tree line, the lookout noticed something unusual, a faint, eerie glow emanating from the forest. At first, they thought it might be the reflection of the moonlight on a patch of fog, but as they continued to watch, the glow grew brighter and began to move. It floated just above the ground, weaving between the trees in a slow, deliberate manner. The lookout felt a growing sense of unease, as if they were witnessing something they shouldn't be seeing. They grabbed their binoculars for a closer look, but the glow was too bright, obscuring any details of what might be causing it. The lookout debated whether to radio for help or investigate the source of the light themselves. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to hike out to the spot where they had seen the glow. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of trepidation, they ventured into the forest. But when they reached the area, there was nothing, no light, no signs of disturbance, just the silent, dark woods. As they turned to head back to the tower, the feeling of being watched washed over them, and they couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlight. The eerie glow never returned, but the memory of that night haunted the lookout long after they left Pine Hollow. 7. The haunted radio transmission. A message from the past. It was late in the season at Granite Peak, and the fire lookout was settling in for another quiet night. The radio, their only connection to the outside world, had been silent for hours when suddenly it crackled to life. At first, the lookout thought it was just static, but then they heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling for help. The lookout strained to hear, adjusting the radio settings, but the signal was weak and filled with interference. The voice was panicked, pleading for assistance, and it gave coordinates that sounded familiar. The lookout quickly checked the map and realized the coordinates were for a location just a few miles away, a spot that had been the site of a devastating fire years earlier. They tried to respond, but there was no reply. The signal cut out, leaving only the hiss of static. Disturbed, the lookout radioed headquarters to report the strange transmission, but they were met with confusion. No one else had heard the call, and there were no known fires or emergencies in the area. The lookout couldn't shake the feeling that the voice they had heard was from someone long dead, perhaps a firefighter who had perished in that very location years ago. Despite several attempts to track down the source of the transmission, no explanation was ever found, and the lookout was left to wonder if they had received a message from beyond the grave. 8. The night the stars vanished. A brush with the unknown. It was supposed to be an ordinary night at High Point Tower, but it turned into something far more disturbing. The lookout was gazing up at the clear night sky, enjoying the view of the stars, when suddenly they began to blink out, one by one. Within minutes, the entire sky was pitch black, as if the stars had been swallowed by an invisible force. The lookout's heart raced as they frantically searched the horizon, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. There was no moon, no clouds, nothing to explain the sudden darkness. The forest below was equally silent, as if the entire world had been plunged into an unnatural stillness. The lookout grabbed their flashlight and stepped outside, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. It was as if the light was being absorbed by the void. The lookout's radio crackled to life, but the voices on the other end were garbled and unintelligible, adding to the growing sense of dread. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the stars reappeared, twinkling in the sky as if nothing had happened. The radio signal cleared, and the world returned to normal, but the lookout knew they had witnessed something extraordinary and terrifying. The event was never explained, and the lookout remained haunted by the memory of the night the stars vanished. 9. The ghostly visitor in the cabin. An unwelcome guest at Lone Peak. Lone Peak was one of the most isolated fire lookout stations in the region, and the lookout stationed there was accustomed to the solitude. But one night, as they were preparing for bed, they heard a knock on the cabin door. Surprised, since visitors were rare, they opened the door, but no one was there. Thinking it might be the wind, they closed the door and returned to their bunk, but the knock came again, louder this time. The lookout opened the door once more, and again found nothing but the empty night. As they turned to close the door, they caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of their eye. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. The figure appeared to be a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, but his features were indistinct. The lookout called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to slowly move toward the cabin. Panicked, the lookout slammed the door shut and locked it, but the knocking continued, now coming from all sides of the cabin, as if multiple hands were beating on the walls. The lookout grabbed their radio, but it was dead, no signal, no power. They spent the night huddled in the corner, listening to the relentless knocking, until it finally stopped just before dawn. When the lookout dared to venture outside, there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The experience left them shaken, and they never spent another night at Lone Peak without wondering if the ghostly visitor would return. 10. The disappearing firefighter of Red Peak, a vanished hero's last call. Red Peak was notorious for its challenging terrain and dangerous fires, but it was also known for a legend that had been passed down among fire lookouts for decades. According to the story, during a massive wildfire years ago, a firefighter went missing while battling the blaze. Despite an extensive search, no trace of him was ever found. The fire was eventually contained, but the missing firefighter was presumed dead. Years later, lookouts at Red Peak began reporting strange occurrences. Equipment that had been carefully stowed away was found scattered, footprints leading into the forest that abruptly ended, and most chilling of all, the sound of a voice calling for help over the radio late at night. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It matched the description of the missing firefighter. Those who heard it said the call came from deep within the burned-out section of the forest where the firefighter had last been seen. But when they tried to respond, the radio would go silent, as if the signal had been cut off. Some believe that the firefighter is still out there, lost in the forest, trying to find his way home. Others think his spirit remains, forever bound to the place where he gave his life in the line of duty. Whatever the truth, the legend of the disappearing firefighter continues to haunt those who serve at Red Peak. 11. The strange lights in the distance. A fire lookout's unsolved mystery. It was a clear, starry night at Elk Ridge, and the fire lookout was scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble when they noticed something unusual: two bright lights in the distance, hovering just above the treetops. At first, the lookout thought it might be a plane or a helicopter, but the lights didn't move. They remained stationary, casting an eerie glow over the forest. Curious, the lookout grabbed their binoculars for a closer look, but the lights were so bright that they obscured any details of what might be causing them. The lights didn't flicker or dim, they just hung in the sky, silent and unmoving. The lookout radioed headquarters to report the sighting, but no other lookouts had seen anything unusual, and there were no scheduled flights in the area. The lights remained visible for several hours, until just before dawn when they suddenly blinked out, leaving the sky dark and empty. The lookout never found an explanation for the strange lights, and they were never seen again. But the experience left them with a lingering sense of unease, as if they had witnessed something otherworldly, something that wasn't meant to be seen. 12. The creepy laughter in the wilderness. A fire lookout's night of terror. Fire lookouts are accustomed to the sounds of the wilderness: birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But one night at Shadow Mountain, a lookout heard something that sent chills down their spine: laughter. It started as a low chuckle, barely audible over the wind, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the trees. The laughter was high-pitched, almost childlike, but there was something off about it, something that made the lookout's blood run cold. It seemed to come from all around, as if the forest itself was laughing at them. The lookout tried to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it kept shifting, moving from one side of the tower to the other, always just out of reach. As the night wore on, the laughter grew more frenzied, more deranged, until it was echoing in the lookout's ears, drowning out all other sounds. The lookout radioed for help, but the signal was filled with static, and no one responded. The laughter continued until the first light of dawn, when it suddenly stopped, leaving the forest in eerie silence. The lookout never found out what caused the laughter, but they were left with a deep sense of unease that lingered long after they left Shadow Mountain. 13. The lost trail in the fog. A lookout's journey into the unknown. One foggy morning at Cedar Bluff, a fire lookout set out on a routine hike to check on a nearby weather station. The trail was familiar, one they had walked many times before, but as the fog thickened, the lookout began to feel disoriented. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the path, which had always been clear, began to twist and turn in unfamiliar ways. No matter how hard they tried to find their way back, the lookout only seemed to get more lost, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep them trapped. The fog was so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few feet, and the lookout's sense of direction was completely thrown off. Hours passed, and the lookout grew increasingly desperate, their calls for help swallowed by the dense mist. Just when they thought they might never find their way out, the fog began to lift, revealing the path home. The lookout was relieved, but as they retraced their steps, they realized something strange. The trail they had been following led in circles, taking them deeper into the forest rather than back to the tower. They never figured out how they got so turned around, but the experience left them with a newfound respect for the mysteries of the wilderness. 14. The Old Man Who Never Left. A ghostly presence at Hawk's Nest. Hawk's Nest had a reputation for being haunted, but the fire lookout stationed there didn't believe in ghosts, at least, not until they encountered the old man. It was just after midnight when the lookout first saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing that surrounded the tower. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and his face was obscured by the shadows. The lookout called out to him, asking if he needed help, but the old man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring up at the tower. The lookout tried to approach him, but as they got closer, the old man simply vanished into thin air. Shaken, the lookout returned to the tower and spent the rest of the night on edge, listening for any signs of the old man's return. Over the next few weeks, the lookout saw the old man several more times, always in the same spot, always silent. Some of the other lookouts claimed that the old man was the ghost of a former lookout who had died on the job, his spirit forever tied to the tower. Whether or not that was true, the lookout couldn't shake the feeling that the old man was watching them, and they were never able to sleep soundly at Hawk's Nest again. 15. The screams that echoed through the valley. A night of horror at Red Canyon. Red Canyon was known for its eerie acoustics, the way sound seemed to carry for miles, amplified by the steep walls of the canyon. But nothing could have prepared the fire lookout stationed there for the screams. It started just after sunset, a single piercing scream that echoed through the valley, followed by another and then another. The lookout froze, listening in horror as the screams continued, growing louder and more frantic. They grabbed their binoculars and scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone in distress. The screams seemed to come from all around, reverberating off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. The lookout radioed for help, but by the time a search team arrived, the screams had stopped and the valley was silent. Despite an extensive search, no one was found, and there were no reports of anyone missing in the area. The lookout was left to wonder what they had heard. Was it an animal in distress, or something far more sinister? The memory of those screams haunted the lookout long after they left Red Canyon, and the mystery of what happened that night remains unsolved. 16. The secret of the burned-out watchtower, a lookout's grim discovery. The old watchtower at Raven's Peak had been abandoned for years. Its chart remained standing as a grim reminder of the wildfire that had swept through the area decades earlier. The new lookout station nearby had heard the stories about the fire, how it had claimed the lives of several firefighters who had been trapped inside the tower when it collapsed. One day, driven by curiosity, the lookout decided to explore the ruins. As they approached, they felt a sudden chill, and the air grew heavy with the smell of smoke. The tower was in worse shape than they had imagined, the wood blackened and brittle, the metal twisted and rusted. But what caught their attention was a small, locked box hidden beneath the floorboards. The lookout pried it open and found a collection of personal items, photographs, letters, and a journal belonging to one of the firefighters who had died in the fire. As they read through the journal, the lookout felt a growing sense of unease. The final entries were frantic, detailing strange occurrences in the days leading up to the fire, unexplained noises, shadows moving in the woods, and a feeling of being watched. The last entry ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence. "I don't think we're alone out here." The lookout quickly left the ruins, but the discovery stayed with them, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had occurred at Raven's Peak. 17. The invisible hand on the ladder. A lookout's terrifying climb. The fire lookout at Ghost Rock had always prided themselves on their fearlessness, but one night that courage was put to the test. It was a stormy evening, the wind howling through the trees, when the lookout heard a strange noise coming from outside the tower. Thinking it might be a loose piece of equipment, they decided to go out and check. As they climbed down the ladder, they suddenly felt a cold, clammy hand grip their ankle. The lookout froze, their heart racing as they looked down, but there was nothing there. The hand released its grip, and the lookout scrambled back up the ladder, shaken to the core. When they reached the top, they looked down again, but the ladder was empty. The lookout spent the rest of the night locked inside the tower, too terrified to venture out again. The experience left them questioning everything they thought they knew about the wilderness, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something had reached out from the darkness to touch them. 18. The night of the blood moon. A lookout's brush with the supernatural. The fire lookout at Blood Mountain had heard the legends about the area, stories of strange occurrences that only happened during the blood moon. A rare lunar event when the moon turns a deep red. But they didn't believe in such things, not until they experienced it for themselves. On the night of the blood moon, the lookout was keeping watch when they noticed a strange light in the distance, flickering like a fire but with an unnatural reddish hue. As they watched, the light began to move, weaving through the trees and growing brighter. The lookout radioed for backup, but the signal was filled with static, and no one responded. As the light drew closer, the lookout felt a growing sense of dread, as if they were being watched by something ancient and malevolent. The light reached the edge of the clearing, illuminating the tower in an eerie red glow, before suddenly vanishing, leaving the lookout in darkness. The blood moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The lookout spent the rest of the night huddled inside the tower, praying for dawn. When the sun finally rose, they were relieved to see that everything was back to normal, but the memory of that night, and the feeling of being watched by something beyond this world, haunted them long after the blood moon had passed. 19. The chilling cold snap in July. A lookout's encounter with the unexplainable. It was the middle of July at Summer Lake, and the fire lookout was enjoying the warm, balmy weather when something strange happened. The temperature began to drop rapidly. Within minutes, the warm summer air was replaced by an icy chill, and frost began to form on the windows of the lookout tower. Confused, the lookout checked the weather reports, but there was no explanation for the sudden cold snap. The temperature continued to plummet, and soon the lookout could see their breath in the air. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of summer, fell eerily silent, as if all the animals had suddenly disappeared. The lookout bundled up in every layer they had, but the cold was relentless, seeping into their bones. As night fell, the cold intensified, and the lookout could barely keep warm, despite having a fire going in the stove. The next morning, the cold snap suddenly lifted, and the temperature returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. The frost melted, and the forest came back to life, but the lookout was left with a deep sense of unease. They had no explanation for what had occurred, and the memory of that chilling night stayed with them, a reminder that the wilderness can be as unpredictable as it is beautiful. 20. The unexplainable blaze on Dead Man's Ridge. A lookout's frantic battle against the flames. Dead Man's Ridge had always been a place of dark legends, stories of lost hikers and strange lights that could be seen in the dead of night. But the fire lookout station there wasn't concerned with ghosts, they were focused on preventing wildfires. One night, during a routine patrol, the lookout spotted a blaze on the ridge. It was small, just a few flames flickering in the darkness, but it was growing quickly. The lookout radioed for help and raced to the scene, but as they approached, the flames suddenly vanished, leaving no trace of the fire behind. Confused, the lookout searched the area, but found nothing, no burnt vegetation, no ash, nothing to suggest that a fire had ever been there. They returned to the tower, only to spot the flames again, this time in a different location. The lookout repeated the process, racing to the site only to find nothing. This continued throughout the night, with the flames appearing and disappearing all over the ridge, always just out of reach. By dawn, the lookout was exhausted and deeply unnerved. They had no explanation for the phantom fires, and though the ridge remained unscathed, the experience left them questioning everything they knew about the job. Was it a natural phenomenon, a trick of the light, or something far more sinister? The mystery of the unexplainable blaze on Dead Man's Ridge remains unsolved, and the lookout who witnessed it was never quite the same again. 21. The distant drumming on Raven's Claw. An unsettling call from the wilderness. Raven's Claw was a rugged, isolated post known for its eerie silence. One night, a fire lookout stationed there began hearing a rhythmic drumming sound echoing through the trees. The sound was faint at first, like distant thunder, but it gradually grew louder, resonating through the forest. The lookout tried to pinpoint the source, but the drumming seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest itself was alive with the sound. It wasn't long before the lookout realized the drumming was following a pattern, almost like a signal or a call. They radioed for assistance, but no one else could hear the sound, and there were no reports of anything unusual in the area. The drumming continued throughout the night, stopping abruptly just before dawn. The next night, it returned, even louder and more insistent. The lookout searched the area but found nothing, no signs of human activity, no animals, nothing that could explain the mysterious drumming. It became a nightly occurrence, haunting the lookout until the end of their assignment. The origin of the sound was never discovered, but the memory of those drumming nights left a lasting mark on the lookout, who swore they had heard a call from something ancient and forgotten. 22. The vanishing cabin on Misty Peak. A lookout's encounter with the impossible. Misty Peak was notorious for its thick, impenetrable fog that rolled in without warning, obscuring everything from view. One day, a fire lookout was hiking a familiar trail when they came across something unexpected, a small weathered cabin that they had never seen before. Curious, the lookout approached, noting the cabin's dilapidated state. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swung in the wind. The lookout hesitated, then stepped inside, finding the interior surprisingly well preserved, as if someone had lived there recently. There were no signs of anyone around, but a half-burned candle on the table suggested someone had been there not long ago. As the lookout explored further, they noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, unlike anything they had seen before. A sudden chill ran down their spine, and they decided to leave. But when they stepped outside, the fog had thickened, and the cabin was gone. The lookout searched the area but couldn't find any trace of it. They returned to the tower and reported the encounter, but no one believed them. There were no records of a cabin in that area. The lookout revisited the site several times, but the cabin never reappeared. The experience left them questioning their own senses and the strange, shifting nature of Misty Peak. 23. The frozen figures in the snow. A winter's tale of terror. Winter on Snowfall Ridge was harsh and unforgiving, but the fire lookout stationed there was prepared for the cold. What they weren't prepared for was what they found after a heavy snowfall. As they made their rounds, the lookout spotted something unusual in the distance, what appeared to be several human figures standing in the snow, perfectly still. Puzzled, the lookout approached, thinking they might be hikers who had gotten lost or stranded. But as they got closer, they realized something was terribly wrong. The figures weren't moving, weren't breathing. They were frozen solid, their expressions locked in fear. The lookout's heart pounded as they realized there were no footprints leading to or from the figures, no signs of struggle or distress. It was as if they had simply appeared there, frozen in place by some unseen force. The lookout hurried back to the tower and radioed for help, but by the time a rescue team arrived, the figures were gone, leaving only undisturbed snow behind. The incident was never explained, and the lookout was left to wonder what they had seen, phantoms of those lost to the cold, or something even more sinister. 24. The howling wind of Bitterroot Bluff. A lookout's descent into madness. Bitterroot Bluff was known for its relentless wind, which howled through the canyons day and night. But for the fire lookout stationed there, the wind brought something more, a voice. It started as a faint murmur, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but soon it grew louder, clearer, until the lookout could hear words. Whispers carried on the breeze, calling their name, urging them to leave the tower and venture into the wilderness. The lookout tried to ignore it, but the voice persisted, growing more insistent with each passing day. It spoke of hidden treasures, of secrets buried deep in the forest, and of dangers that lurked in the shadows. The lookout began to feel as if they were being watched, as if something was out there waiting for them. Sleep became impossible, and the lookout grew paranoid, convinced that the voice was trying to lure them to their doom. One night, driven to the brink of madness, the lookout finally gave in and followed the voice into the darkness. They wandered the forest for hours, driven by a force they couldn't understand, until they collapsed from exhaustion. When they awoke, the voice was gone, and they were alone in the silent woods. They made their way back to the tower, but the experience left them shaken, and they were never the same. The wind continued to howl, but the lookout knew better than to listen to its whispers. 25. The disembodied hand at Thunder Hill. A lookout's horrifying discovery. Thunder Hill was a remote, windswept peak known for its violent storms and treacherous terrain. One night, during a particularly fierce thunderstorm, a fire lookout stationed there made a horrifying discovery. They were securing loose equipment when they noticed something sticking out of the ground near the base of the tower, a hand. At first, the lookout thought it might be part of a buried statue or some other artifact, but as they dug deeper, they realized the hand was disturbingly lifelike. It was perfectly preserved, as if it had been frozen in time, the skin smooth and unblemished despite being partially buried in the dirt. The lookout recoiled in horror, unsure of what they had found. They radioed for help, and a team was dispatched to investigate. But when they arrived, the hand was gone, leaving only disturbed earth where it had been. The lookout was questioned extensively, but no one could explain what they had seen. The incident was written off as a hallucination, brought on by stress or fatigue, but the lookout knew what they had found. The memory of that disembodied hand haunted them, a reminder that some things are best left buried. 26. The Haunted Bridge of Shadow Creek. A lookout's encounter with the past. Shadow Creek was a narrow, fast-moving stream that wound its way through the dense forest below the lookout tower. A rickety old bridge spanned the creek, and locals claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who had drowned in the waters below. The fire lookout stationed there didn't believe in ghosts, but that changed one foggy evening when they decided to cross the bridge. As they reached the middle, they heard a splash, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden planks. The lookout turned, expecting to see someone, but the bridge was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder and faster, as if someone was running toward them. The lookout hurried across the bridge, but the footsteps followed, relentless and terrifying. When they finally reached the other side, the footsteps stopped and the fog lifted, revealing the creek below, calm and undisturbed. Shaken, the lookout returned to the tower, but the experience left them questioning everything they knew about the bridge and the stories surrounding it. The haunted bridge of Shadow Creek remained a place of fear, and the lookout never crossed it again without remembering the footsteps that followed them through the fog. 27. The face in the window. A lookout's chilling encounter. High atop the tower at Windy Point, a fire lookout was enjoying a peaceful evening when they noticed something strange, a face staring back at them through the window. The lookout froze, heart pounding, as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The face was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a silent scream. It was pressed against the glass, as if trying to get in. The lookout leaped back, expecting the glass to shatter, but the face remained still, unmoving, yet terrifyingly real. The lookout grabbed their flashlight and shone it at the window, but the face didn't disappear. It just stared, unblinking, as if it was trapped between this world and the next. Panicked, the lookout ran to the door and threw it open, but there was no one outside. When they turned back, the face was gone, leaving only a faint outline on the glass, as if something had been pressed against it. The lookout was left shaken, unable to explain what they had seen. The face never returned, but the memory of that night haunted the lookout, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. 28. The voices in the dark. A lookout's descent into madness. At the remote outpost of Blackwater Tower, a fire lookout began hearing voices in the darkness. They started as faint whispers, barely audible over the wind, but soon grew louder, more insistent. The voices spoke in a language the lookout didn't understand, but the tone was clear, urgent, pleading, and filled with a deep, unsettling fear. The lookout tried to ignore the voices, but they only grew more persistent, filling the tower with their frantic, desperate pleas. The lookout began to feel as if they were being watched, as if the voices were coming from all around, closing in on them. Sleep became impossible, and the lookout's grip on reality began to slip. They started seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision, and strange, unexplainable marks appeared on the walls of the tower. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they were screaming, drowning out all other sounds. The lookout couldn't take it anymore. One night, driven to the brink of madness, they smashed the radio, hoping to silence the voices. But it didn't work. The voices continued, echoing through the tower, until the lookout could no longer tell what was real and what was not. When they were finally relieved of duty, the lookout was a broken shell of their former self, unable to explain what had happened or why the voices had chosen them. 29. The ghostly campfire of Lost Lake. A lookout's search for the truth. Lost Lake was a remote, serene spot nestled deep within the forest, accessible only by a long, winding trail. One evening, a fire lookout spotted a campfire burning on the shores of the lake. Concerned that it might be an unauthorized fire, they decided to investigate. As they approached, they could see figures sitting around the fire, their shadows dancing in the flickering light. But as they got closer, the figures vanished, leaving the fire burning unattended. The lookout called out, but there was no response. When they reached the campsite, the fire was cold, as if it had been extinguished hours earlier. Confused, the lookout searched the area but found no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no camping gear, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there. They returned to the tower, but the campfire continued to appear night after night, always in the same spot, always vanishing when approached. The locals whispered that the lake was haunted by the spirits of those who had drowned in its waters, their ghosts doomed to relive their final moments around the campfire. Whether or not that was true, the lookout couldn't shake the feeling that they had witnessed something otherworldly, a glimpse into a world beyond their understanding. 30. The flickering lantern of Willow's End. A lookout's night of terror. Willow's End was a lonely outpost, surrounded by dense woods, and known for its eerie, unnatural silence. One night, a fire lookout noticed a lantern flickering in the distance, bobbing up and down as if someone was walking through the forest. Concerned that it might be a lost hiker, the lookout grabbed their flashlight and set out to investigate. The lantern's light was faint, but it provided just enough illumination to guide the lookout through the trees. As they drew closer, the light suddenly stopped moving, hovering in the air like a firefly. The lookout called out, but there was no response. They shone their flashlight toward the lantern, but it flickered and disappeared, leaving the lookout in total darkness. The air grew cold, and the lookout felt a chill run down their spine. They turned to head back to the tower, but the path was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in as the lookout realized they were lost, the trees closing in around them. The lantern reappeared, this time much closer, but it was no longer a comforting guide. It was a sinister, malevolent presence. The lookout ran, stumbling through the forest, until they finally found their way back to the tower. When they looked back, the lantern was gone, leaving only the memory of that terrifying night. The lookout never ventured into the woods at Willow's End again, haunted by the knowledge that something was out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. 31. The Screaming Tree of Ashen Hollow. A lookout's battle with nature's wrath. Ashen Hollow was notorious for its twisted, ancient trees, which stood like sentinels guarding a secret. But one tree in particular had a reputation for driving people away, a gnarled oak that locals called the Screaming Tree. The fire lookout station nearby had heard the stories but dismissed them as mere superstition. That changed one stormy night when, as they were making rounds, they heard a blood-curdling scream emanating from the direction of the tree. It was a sound so raw, so filled with pain, that it sent shivers down their spine. The lookout hesitated but decided to investigate. As they approached the tree, the scream grew louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was trapped inside. The tree's branches whipped in the wind like angry arms, and the ground around it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The lookout's flashlight flickered, and they felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But just as they were about to turn back, the screaming stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The tree stood motionless, its branches still, as if nothing had happened. The lookout retreated to the tower, shaken to their core. They avoided the screaming tree after that night, but the sound of that scream haunted their dreams, a reminder that some parts of the forest are better left undisturbed. 32. The Phantom Campers of Whispering Pines. A lookout's unwanted guests. Whispering Pines was a serene and peaceful spot known for its beautiful vistas and tranquil atmosphere. But for the fire lookout stationed there, the peace was shattered one summer night when they noticed a group of campers setting up a site not far from the tower. At first, it seemed ordinary. Tents were pitched, a fire was lit, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air. But as the lookout watched, something strange happened. The campers' voices began to distort, their laughter turning into something dark and sinister. The figures around the fire seemed to blur, as if they were not quite real. The lookout radioed for help, but when they looked back at the campsite, it was empty, no tents, no campers, no fire. The ground where the site had been was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. The lookout was left bewildered and deeply unsettled, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The locals later told them of a group of campers who had gone missing in the area years before, never to be found. The lookout couldn't help but wonder if they had seen the ghosts of those lost souls, forever trapped in the forest, trying to relive their final moments. 33. The Blood-Stained Rock at Devil's Basin. A lookout's encounter with the past. Devil's Basin was a place steeped in dark history, a desolate valley where many unfortunate souls had met their end. One day, while out on a routine patrol, a fire lookout stumbled upon a large, flat rock that seemed out of place among the rugged terrain. The rock was stained a deep, rusted red, as if soaked in blood. Curious and disturbed, the lookout examined the rock more closely and noticed what appeared to be old carvings, symbols and markings that they couldn't decipher. The sight of the blood-like stain made the lookout uneasy, and they quickly returned to the tower. That night, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it whispers that seemed to come from all around. When the lookout closed their eyes, they saw visions of violence and death, as if the rock had absorbed the suffering of those who had died there. The next morning, the lookout returned to the spot, but the rock was gone, vanished without a trace. The blood-stained rock, and the horrors it held, had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving the lookout to wonder if it had ever been real at all. 34. The Relentless Knocking at Black Bear Tower, a lookout's night of terror. Black Bear Tower was perched on a remote mountainside, surrounded by dense forest that was home to all manner of wildlife. But one night, the fire lookout stationed there was awakened by a persistent knocking at the door of the tower. The sound was steady, rhythmic, as if someone or something was demanding to be let in. The lookout, groggy and disoriented, assumed it was an animal, perhaps a bear, but when they opened the door, there was nothing there. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent, echoing through the tower. The lookout checked the windows, the roof, even the base of the tower, but found no sign of anyone or anything that could be causing the noise. As the hours dragged on, the knocking grew frantic, as if whatever was outside was desperate to get in. The lookout barricaded the door and huddled in a corner, praying for the dawn. When the first light of day finally broke, the knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. The lookout cautiously opened the door and stepped outside, but there was no sign of any disturbance, no footprints, no claw marks, nothing to explain the relentless knocking. The experience left the lookout deeply shaken, and they never spent another night at Black Bear Tower without fear of what might come knocking again. 35. The ghostly trail at Echo Ridge, a lookout's frightening discovery. Echo Ridge was a place of eerie beauty, where the mountains seemed to amplify every sound, making the forest feel alive with whispers and echoes. One evening, as a fire lookout was finishing up their patrol, they noticed a faint trail that seemed to have appeared overnight. It wasn't on any map, and the lookout was certain they had never seen it before. Curious, they decided to follow it, hoping it might lead to an interesting discovery. The trail wound through the trees, twisting and turning in ways that made the lookout feel increasingly disoriented. The further they walked, the darker and quieter the forest became, until it felt like the world had been swallowed by shadow. Suddenly, the trail ended abruptly at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The lookout hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, but their curiosity got the better of them. As they approached the cabin, the air grew thick, and the sounds of the forest disappeared completely. The lookout reached for the door, but before they could touch it, the cabin and the trail vanished, leaving them standing alone in the middle of the forest. The lookout ran back to the tower, heart pounding, and never ventured off the marked paths again. They later learned that a cabin matching the description had once stood in that area, but had burned down years ago, taking the lives of those inside. The ghostly trail, it seemed, had led them to a place that no longer existed, a place trapped in time. 36. The flickering lights of Granite Pass. A lookout's battle with the unknown. Granite Pass was a rugged, windswept mountain range known for its treacherous weather and difficult terrain. The fire lookout stationed there was used to dealing with harsh conditions, but nothing could have prepared them for the strange lights that began appearing in the distance one night. At first, the lights were faint, flickering like stars on the horizon, but as the night wore on, they grew brighter and more numerous. The lights danced in the sky, moving in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The lookout radioed for assistance, but the signal was filled with static and no one responded. The lights continued to grow, spreading across the sky until it looked as though the entire mountain range was on fire. The lookout was mesmerized, unable to look away, even as a deep sense of dread settled over them. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights blinked out, leaving the night sky dark and empty. The next day, the lookout discovered that no one else had seen the lights, and there were no reports of any unusual activity in the area. The experience left them questioning what they had seen. Was it a natural phenomenon, an optical illusion, or something far more mysterious? The flickering lights of Granite Pass remain an unsolved mystery, and the lookout never forgot the night they danced across the sky. 37. The lone figure on Widow's Peak. A lookout's chilling encounter. Widow's Peak was a desolate, windswept summit known for its tragic history, a place where many had lost their lives over the years. The fire lookout stationed there had heard of the stories but wasn't one to believe in ghosts. That changed one cold, foggy evening when they spotted a lone figure standing at the edge of the cliff. The figure was tall and dressed in dark, tattered clothes, their face obscured by the fog. The lookout called out, concerned that the person might be in danger, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned and began walking toward the edge of the cliff. The lookout's heart raced as they realized what was about to happen, and they rushed to stop the figure. But as they approached, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the swirling fog behind. The lookout searched the area but found no trace of anyone, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. They'd returned to the tower, shaken and deeply unsettled. The locals later told them that the figure was likely the ghost of a widow who had thrown herself from the cliff after losing her husband in a mining accident. Whether or not that was true, the lookout couldn't shake the feeling that they had witnessed something tragic and otherworldly, a glimpse into a past filled with sorrow and loss. 38. The Weeping Woman of Misty Hollow. A lookout's encounter with a legend. Misty Hollow was a place of dark, tangled woods and thick, swirling fog, a place that locals avoided after dark. They spoke of a woman who wandered the hollow, weeping for her lost child, a spirit doomed to search the woods for eternity. The fire lookout stationed there had heard the legend, but didn't give it much thought. Until one night, when they heard the sound of sobbing echoing through the trees. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, more desperate, until it filled the air with sorrow. The lookout felt a chill run down their spine and tried to convince themselves that it was just the wind. But the sobbing continued, moving closer to the tower. The lookout peered into the darkness, and through the fog they saw her, a pale, gaunt figure dressed in tattered clothes, her face hidden beneath a veil of dark hair. She moved slowly, her shoulders shaking with each sob, as if the weight of her grief was too much to bear. The lookout watched in stunned silence as the woman drifted past the tower and disappeared into the woods. The sobbing faded, leaving the forest in an eerie silence. The lookout never saw the weeping woman again, but the memory of her haunted them, a reminder of the tragedy that had left its mark on Misty Hollow. 39. The Old Journal of Broken Ridge. A lookout's descent into madness. Broken Ridge was a remote, windswept mountain range where the weather was as unpredictable as the terrain. While stationed there, a fire lookout discovered an old weather journal hidden beneath the floorboards of the tower. The journal belonged to a previous lookout, and its pages were filled with detailed entries about strange occurrences in the area, unexplained noises, mysterious lights, and a growing sense of dread. As the lookout read on, the entries became more erratic, filled with ramblings about being watched, about something lurking in the shadows. The final entries were almost incoherent, the handwriting shaky and desperate, ending with a single chilling sentence, "It's here." The lookout felt a creeping sense of unease as they realized that the journal's author had disappeared without a trace. From that moment on, the lookout began to experience strange things themselves, objects moving on their own, whispers in the wind, and a constant feeling of being watched. The journal's influence seemed to seep into their mind, driving them to the brink of madness. They tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts away, but the fear was too strong. The lookout barely made it through the season and left Broken Ridge as soon as their assignment ended, leaving the journal behind. But the memory of what they had read and experienced stayed with them, a dark shadow that they could never fully escape. 40. The Silent Stalker of Shadow Mountain. A lookout's unseen terror. Shadow Mountain was known for its dense, dark forests, where the trees grew so close together that little sunlight could penetrate the canopy. The fire lookout stationed there was used to the darkness, but one night they began to feel as if something was following them. It started with a feeling of unease, a sense that they were being watched. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger, more oppressive. The lookout began to hear faint rustling sounds in the trees, just beyond the range of their flashlight, but every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. The feeling of being followed persisted, even when they were inside the tower. They would hear footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the floorboards, and the soft sound of breathing as if someone or something was standing right behind them. The lookout's nerves were frayed, and sleep became impossible as they constantly felt the presence of the silent stalker. One night, the feeling became unbearable, and the lookout fled the tower, only to realize that the presence had followed them into the woods. They ran through the trees, heart pounding, until they reached the safety of the nearest town. They never returned to Shadow Mountain, unable to face the terror of what might be lurking in the darkness. The silent stalker remains a mystery, a terrifying reminder that sometimes the most frightening things are the ones we cannot see. 41. The Wailing Winds of Widow's Hollow. A lookout's battle with the past. Widow's Hollow was named for the mournful sound of the wind as it whipped through the narrow valley, creating an eerie wailing noise that could unsettle even the most seasoned fire lookout. One cold autumn night, the wind seemed to carry with it something more, a sound that was almost human. As the lookout stood by the window, they heard what sounded like crying, interspersed with the wind's wail. It was a haunting, sorrowful sound, as if someone was grieving deeply. The lookout initially tried to dismiss it as a trick of the wind, but as the night wore on, the crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the hollow. The lookout ventured outside, hoping to find the source, but all they could see was the dark, wind-blown landscape. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unable to locate the source, the lookout retreated to the tower, but sleep was impossible with the relentless crying filling the night. When dawn finally broke, the crying stopped, leaving only the wind's usual wail. The lookout later learned that Widow's Hollow had been the site of a tragic accident decades earlier, where a woman had lost her husband and child in a sudden landslide. Some believed her spirit still haunted the hollow, forever grieving her lost family. The lookout couldn't shake the feeling that they had heard the echo of that tragedy carried on the wind through the ages. 42. The disappearing footprints of Ravenwood. A lookout's encounter with the unseen. Ravenwood was a dense, shadowy forest known for its impenetrable darkness even during the day. The fire lookout stationed there was used to the isolation, but one winter morning they found something unusual: footprints in the freshly fallen snow, leading from the edge of the forest to the base of the tower. The footprints were small, as if made by a child, but they were deep, indicating that whoever had made them was wearing heavy boots. Puzzled, the lookout followed the tracks, but they abruptly stopped halfway to the tower, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no other tracks leading away. The lookout searched the area thoroughly, but the footprints ended so suddenly and mysteriously that it left them deeply unsettled. Later that night, they heard soft knocking on the tower door, but when they opened it, there was no one there, only more footprints, appearing as if by magic, leading away into the woods. The lookout was left with a chilling realization. Something was out there, something that could appear and disappear at will, leaving only its footprints behind as a haunting reminder of its presence. 43. The Howling Beast of Thunder Bluff. A lookout's terrifying encounter. Thunder Bluff was a rugged outpost known for its dramatic thunderstorms and the deafening roar of wind through the canyons. But one night, a fire lookout stationed there heard a sound that was unlike anything they had ever encountered, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo through the rocks and trees. At first, the lookout thought it might be a bear or a mountain lion, but the sound was far too loud, too menacing, to be any ordinary animal. The growl was followed by a series of howls, each one louder and more terrifying than the last, reverberating through the canyon like a primal scream. The lookout grabbed their flashlight and cautiously scanned the area, but the beam of light revealed nothing but the rocky landscape. The howls continued, growing closer and more frantic, as if the beast was circling the tower, searching for a way in. The lookout's heart raced as they realized they were being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. The howling persisted throughout the night, only stopping with the first light of dawn. When the lookout finally dared to venture outside, they found deep claw marks gouged into the rocks around the tower, as if something had tried to break through the stone itself. The experience left the lookout shaken, convinced that Thunder Bluff was home to a creature of nightmares, a beast that prowled the wilderness, hidden from human eyes. 44. The shimmering apparition of Crystal Lake. A lookout's glimpse beyond the veil. Crystal Lake was a serene, beautiful spot surrounded by dense forest, its surface often calm and reflective like a mirror. But one misty morning, as a fire lookout scanned the area, they noticed something strange, an apparition shimmering just above the water's surface. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, but as the figure became clearer, the lookout could see it was the ghostly image of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing as if waiting for someone. The apparition didn't move, didn't speak, but seemed to be staring directly at the lookout, her expression one of deep sorrow. The lookout watched, transfixed, as the figure slowly faded, leaving the water undisturbed. The sighting was brief, but it left the lookout deeply unsettled. They later learned that the lake had a dark history. Years ago, a woman had drowned there under mysterious circumstances, her body never recovered. Locals believed her spirit lingered, waiting for justice or perhaps for the loved one she had lost. The lookout couldn't shake the feeling that they had seen the ghost of that woman, her sorrowful spirit forever bound to the waters of Crystal Lake. 45. The whispering shadows of Ironwood Forest. A lookout's descent into fear. Ironwood Forest was a dark, forbidding place known for its towering trees and the deep, impenetrable shadows they cast. The fire lookout stationed there was used to the eerie atmosphere, but one night they began to notice something strange, whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from the shadows at the edge of the forest. At first, the whispers were faint, barely audible, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. The lookout strained to hear, trying to make out the words, but they were in a language they couldn't understand, an ancient, guttural tongue that sent chills down their spine. The whispers seemed to come from all around, circling the tower, growing in intensity until they filled the air with a cacophony of voices. The lookout felt a deep sense of dread, as if the shadows were alive, watching and waiting. Sleep was impossible as the whispers continued throughout the night, stopping only with the first light of dawn. The lookout reported the incident, but no explanation was ever found. The whispers returned on subsequent nights, each time more terrifying than the last, leaving the lookout convinced that Ironwood Forest was haunted by something ancient and malevolent, something that lurked in the shadows, whispering secrets that no human should ever hear. 46. The Lantern of the Lost Miner. A lookout's brush with the supernatural. Copper Canyon was once the site of a bustling mining operation, but the mines had long since been abandoned, leaving behind only ghost towns and crumbling ruins. One night, a fire lookout stationed near the old mines noticed a faint light flickering in the distance, a lantern swaying back and forth as if being carried by someone walking through the canyon. The lookout knew that no one should be in the area, especially at night, so they grabbed their binoculars and tried to get a better look. The light moved slowly, methodically, following the old mining trail that led deep into the canyon. The lookout radioed for backup, but before help could arrive, the light began to flicker and dim, as if the person carrying it was moving farther away. The lookout decided to investigate and followed the light into the canyon. As they drew closer, they noticed that the light was coming from an old-fashioned lantern, the kind used by miners a century ago. But when the lookout reached the spot where the light had been, there was no one there, only the cold, empty canyon. The lantern, too, had disappeared. The lookout returned to the tower, deeply shaken, and later learned that the area was said to be haunted by the ghost of a miner who had been trapped in a cave-in and never found. Some believed that the miner's spirit still wandered the canyon, carrying his lantern as he searched for a way out. The lookout couldn't help but wonder if they had seen that lost soul, forever doomed to walk the desolate trails of Copper Canyon. 47. The strange visitor at Eagle's Perch. A lookout's unsettling encounter. Eagle's Perch was a high, windswept tower with a commanding view of the surrounding forest. One evening, as the fire lookout was preparing dinner, they heard a knock at the door. This was unusual, as the tower was far from any trails or roads, and visitors were rare. The lookout opened the door to find an elderly man standing outside, dressed in old, weathered clothes. His eyes were strange, pale and unfocused, as if he wasn't really seeing the lookout. The man spoke in a low, rasping voice, asking for shelter from the cold. The lookout, uneasy but not wanting to be rude, invited him inside. As the man warmed himself by the fire, he began to tell stories of the old days, of lost loves and bitter regrets. His voice was haunting, filled with sorrow, and the lookout couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The man never ate, never drank, just stared into the fire as he spoke. After a while, he fell silent, and when the lookout looked over, the man was gone, disappeared without a sound, leaving no trace behind. The door had never opened, the wind had never stirred, and yet the man was nowhere to be found. The lookout searched the area but found nothing, not even footprints in the dirt. Later, they learned that a man matching the description had lived in the area long ago, but he had died decades before. The lookout was left to wonder if they had entertained a ghost, a restless spirit seeking warmth and companionship one last time. 48. The Phantom Bridge at Snake River. A lookout's terrifying journey. Snake River was known for its fast-moving waters and treacherous rapids, a place where many had lost their lives over the years. The fire lookout station nearby had always avoided the river at night, but one evening they had no choice but to cross it. As they approached the riverbank, they saw a bridge spanning the water, one they had never seen before. It was an old, rickety structure made of rotting wood, but it seemed sturdy enough. The lookout, in a hurry, decided to cross, but as soon as they stepped onto the bridge, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The wood creaked underfoot, and the air grew cold, as if the bridge was pulling them into another world. Halfway across, the lookout looked down and saw faces in the water. Pale, ghostly faces staring up at them with hollow eyes. The lookout panicked and ran, but the bridge seemed to stretch on forever, the other side growing more distant with each step. Finally, with a last desperate leap, they reached the far bank, collapsing in fear. When they looked back, the bridge was gone, replaced by the raging river. The lookout never spoke of the incident, but they couldn't forget the terror of that night and the faces that had watched them from the depths of Snake River. 49. The Eyes in the Dark. A lookout's night of sheer terror. Silver Pine Ridge was known for its towering trees and deep shadows that seemed to swallow the light even during the day. One night, as a fire lookout was scanning the forest, they noticed a pair of glowing eyes staring back at them from the darkness. The eyes were large, unblinking, and a sickly yellow color, unlike any animal the lookout had ever seen. They hovered in the air at a height that suggested something tall, something unnatural. The lookout felt a surge of fear as the eyes moved closer, slowly and deliberately, as if whatever they belonged to was studying them. The lookout grabbed their flashlight and shone it toward the eyes, but the beam of light did nothing to reveal the creature. The eyes continued to move, circling the tower, growing brighter as they approached. The lookout's heart pounded as they realized they were being stalked by something that didn't belong in the natural world. The eyes followed them everywhere they went, never blinking, never looking away. The lookout spent the night in terror, too afraid to sleep or turn off the light. When dawn finally came, the eyes disappeared, fading into the morning mist as if they had never been there. But the memory of those eyes, cold, calculating, and otherworldly, haunted the lookout long after they left Silver Pine Ridge. 50. The Cursed Map of Fallen Timber. A lookout's descent into madness. Fallen Timber was a remote outpost surrounded by a forest that had been devastated by fire years before. The fire lookout stationed there found an old map hidden in the tower, tucked away in a dusty drawer. The map was detailed, showing the layout of the forest as it had been before the fire, but it was also marked with strange symbols and notes in a handwriting the lookout didn't recognize. Curious, the lookout began to study the map, hoping to learn more about the area's history. But as they did, strange things began to happen. The lookout started hearing voices, faint and distant, as if coming from the very trees that had burned. They saw shadows moving in the corners of their vision, and at night they dreamed of the forest as it once was, alive with fire and filled with the screams of those trapped within. The map seemed to hold a power over them, drawing them deeper into its mysteries until they could think of nothing else. The lookout's behavior became erratic, their sleep disturbed by nightmares, their waking hours filled with a growing sense of dread. Finally, in a moment of clarity, the lookout destroyed the map, burning it in the tower stove. But even as the flames consumed it, the lookout felt a lingering presence, as if the map had left something behind, an imprint on their mind that would never fade. The lookout left Fallen Timber soon after, unable to shake the feeling that they had come too close to something dark and dangerous, something that should have remained hidden in the ashes of the past. 51. The Ghost Ship of Clear Lake, a lookout's impossible vision. Clear Lake was a tranquil body of water nestled in the heart of a dense forest, its surface often calm and mirror-like. But one foggy morning, a fire lookout stationed nearby saw something that defied explanation, a ship, large and ancient, sailing silently across the lake. The ship was ghostly, its sails tattered and its deck empty, yet it moved with purpose, cutting through the fog as if on a long-forgotten voyage. The lookout rubbed their eyes, convinced it was a mirage or an optical illusion, but the ship remained, its ghostly form visible through the mist. The lookout watched in stunned silence as the ship slowly vanished into the fog, leaving no trace of its passing. Later, they learned that no ships had ever sailed on Clear Lake. It was too small, too remote, and had no history of navigation. The locals spoke of a legend, though, of a ship that had been lost at sea centuries ago, its crew doomed to sail the waters of the world forever, never finding rest. The lookout couldn't shake the feeling that they had seen that ship, its ghostly crew still searching for a way home, forever bound to the misty waters of Clear Lake. 53. The silent forest of Blackwater Creek, a lookout's chilling revelation. Blackwater Creek was a remote, eerie place where the trees grew thick and the light barely penetrated the dense canopy. The fire lookout stationed there quickly noticed something unsettling about the forest. It was completely silent. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and the usual sounds of the wilderness were absent. At first, the lookout thought it was just an anomaly, but as the days passed, the silence became oppressive, unnatural. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, and the air grew thick with an unspoken menace. The lookout began to hear things. A faint humming, like the sound of distant machinery, and whispers that seemed to come from the very ground itself. At night, the silence was broken only by the sound of footsteps outside the tower, but no one was ever there. The lookout became convinced that the forest was alive, that it was watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. They left Blackwater Creek as soon as their assignment was over, but the memory of that silent, sinister forest stayed with them, a reminder that some places are beyond human understanding, places where the natural world gives way to something darker, something that lurks in the silence. 54. The vanishing lights of Starfall Ridge. A lookout's unsolved mystery. Starfall Ridge was known for its spectacular night skies, where stars seemed to hang low enough to touch. But one night, a fire lookout stationed there witnessed something extraordinary and terrifying. The stars began to vanish, one by one. It started with a single star, blinking out as if someone had snuffed it like a candle. Then another and another, until entire constellations were swallowed by the darkness. The lookout watched in horror as the night sky was consumed by an impenetrable blackness, leaving only a few faint points of light flickering on the horizon. The air grew cold, and the lookout felt a profound sense of dread, as if the very fabric of the universe was unraveling. The radio was dead, the lights in the tower flickered and dimmed, and the lookout was plunged into a darkness so complete that it seemed to press in from all sides. Just when it seemed that the last star would vanish, the darkness receded, and the stars returned, twinkling innocently in the night sky, as if nothing had happened. The experience left the lookout shaken and bewildered. No one believed their story, and there was no explanation for the vanishing lights. But the lookout knew what they had seen, something that defied the natural order, a glimpse into a darkness that threatened to consume everything. 55. The screeching banshee of Frost Hollow. A lookout's night of sheer terror. Frost Hollow was a cold, wind-swept valley where the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of voices. But one night, as a fire lookout was settling in for the evening, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, a piercing, unearthly screech that echoed through the hollow like a scream from the depths of hell. The sound was so loud, so terrifying, that it shook the tower to its foundations. The lookout scrambled to the window, expecting to see some wild animal, but the hollow was empty. The screech came again, louder and more frantic, as if something was in agony. The lookout tried to radio for help, but the signal was lost in a burst of static. The screeching continued, growing more intense, until it was joined by a chorus of wails and cries that filled the night with a cacophony of terror. The lookout covered their ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate their very soul, filling them with a primal fear. It was as if the banshee herself had come to Frost Hollow, bringing with her the cries of the damned. The sounds continued until just before dawn, when they suddenly stopped, leaving the hollow in an eerie silence. The lookout was left trembling, unable to explain what they had heard, but convinced that they had encountered something otherworldly, something that had no place in the living world. 56. The twisting path of Pinewood Trail, a lookout's harrowing experience. Pinewood Trail was a narrow, winding path that cut through the dense forest surrounding a remote fire lookout tower. It was a favorite route for the lookout to take on their daily patrols, but one day, the trail took them somewhere they didn't expect. As they walked, the path began to twist and turn in ways it never had before, leading them deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the underbrush became dense and tangled. The lookout tried to turn back, but the trail had changed, blocking their way with thick brambles and towering trees that hadn't been there moments before. The air grew heavy, the light dim, and the lookout felt a growing sense of dread as they realized they were lost, trapped in a place that defied all logic. The path continued to twist and shift, leading the lookout in circles until they were completely disoriented. Hours passed, and the lookout's fear turned to panic as they realized they couldn't find their way back. Just when it seemed that they would be lost forever, the trail suddenly straightened, leading them back to the tower as if nothing had happened. The lookout never spoke of the incident, but they refused to set foot on Pinewood Trail again, convinced that the forest had tried to trap them, to take them somewhere they could never return from. 57. The chilling voice in the wind. A lookout's brush with the supernatural. Winter at Glacier Ridge was harsh, with biting winds and snow that piled up to the windows of the fire lookout tower. But one night, as the wind howled outside, the lookout heard something that made their blood run cold. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. The voice was soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind's howl, but as the night wore on, it grew clearer, more insistent. It was a woman's voice, filled with sorrow, calling out for help. The lookout strained to hear, convinced it was someone lost in the storm, but when they opened the window, the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice grew louder, pleading, begging the lookout to come outside. The lookout grabbed their coat and flashlight and ventured out into the snow, but as soon as they stepped outside, the voice stopped, leaving only the howling wind. Confused, the lookout returned to the tower, but the voice came again, this time more frantic, as if the woman was in terrible danger. The lookout was torn between the fear of what they might find and the need to help, but something in the voice chilled them to the core. It wasn't human, or at least, not anymore. The voice continued to call throughout the night, growing more desperate with each passing hour until it suddenly stopped just before dawn. The lookout was left shaken, unable to forget the sound of that voice, and convinced that they had come dangerously close to something otherworldly, something that wanted to lure them into the storm, never to return. 58. The ghostly campfire at Red Rock Ridge. A lookout's unsettling discovery. Red Rock Ridge was a desolate, rocky outcrop that offered stunning views of the surrounding wilderness. But one night, as a fire lookout scanned the area, they noticed a campfire burning on the ridge, a fire that hadn't been there moments before. The lookout was puzzled, as no one should have been in the area, especially at night. They grabbed their binoculars and focused on the fire, but what they saw made their blood run cold. Around the fire sat several figures, their faces obscured by shadows, but their presence unmistakable. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there staring into the flames. The lookout called out, but there was no response. They decided to investigate and made their way to the ridge, but as they approached, the campfire flickered and vanished, leaving only cold, untouched ground where it had been. The figures were gone, as if they had never been there. The lookout was left standing in the darkness, deeply unsettled by what they had seen. Later, they learned that Red Rock Ridge was the site of a tragic event years ago, where a group of campers had perished in a sudden, unexplained fire. The lookout couldn't shake the feeling that they had seen the ghosts of those lost souls, forever trapped in the moment of their demise, reliving their final moments around the ghostly campfire.